Hi. We continue today in 1 Samuel 9 as two of our major characters, Saul, the first king to be anointed, or is he anointed to be king, as we'll see, and Samuel, the prophet, man of God, seer, priest, judge, kingmaker, meet for the first time. And as we'll see, and as many scholars have noted over the long haul, the relationship between Saul and Samuel is an intense one, with Samuel immediately taking charge and bossing Saul around in the name of Yahweh, in the name of his own power, or some combination of both. It's hard to say for sure. So as we look at this one passage here in 9:15 to 21, as you can see on the right side of the screen, the blue part of the chiasm there, the first C part, although we're going to start in verse 14, we need to recognize that this is the first of a series of meetings between Saul and Samuel. So it might give us some perspective on the immediacy of this first scene to see the trajectory of them as we go. We'll also, besides looking at the set of scenes with Saul and Samuel and the chiastic structure of this, as you can see now, we're also going to look at how the authors use a few key words to emphasize not only what's being said in the plot of the story, this encounter between Saul and Samuel that will lead to a banquet in the next scene, but also the larger problems of monarchy and Yahweh and leadership in Israel, as we'll see. So let's jump in right now. So again, drawing your attention to the C part of the chiasm, and that'll be matched on the flip side of the banquet, as we'll see. So what we've seen so far is them setting out on the journey. We've already looked at the fact that the donkeys are plainly not the key issue, or whether the donkeys represent the Israelite people or something else. They're going to drop out of the story momentarily, as we'll see. Saul, has been accompanied by one of his servant boys that his father Kish sent with him, told him to choose to go out on the journey, and then they encountered girls coming up to draw water from the well. And so that's where we are as verse 14 starts, as they went into the town. And before we jump into the text itself, let me draw attention to the things I was just naming. So first, key words here. So already we see town or city, Ir, as you can see down the last one on the list there, used a number of times in this section. The fact that the city is not named but referred to repeatedly draws attention to the fact that it's an urban place, a place of community, but not one of the named places like Shiloh or Ramah or Saul's hometown of Gibeah. So we'll explore that as we go too. The other key words while I'm there that we can see, the double meaning of the Hebrew kur, meaning both to call or to invite, and we'll see that as those who are invited to the banquet in the middle of the chiasm, but also to come toward, as we see here in verse 14. Samuel saw Samuel coming out toward them. So there's a key word there, and you can see it's used 7 of 51 times. Not a wild packing of them. Sometimes we'll see words that are really packed into one place, but certainly a collection of them there to indicate that the question is about being invited or coming toward, and the dance between Saul and Samuel of who's coming toward who as people, and who's coming toward the people of Israel, and who's coming toward Yahweh is one that we'll see throughout. Then the place also you see in verse 14 described in the New RSV as the shrine, or the high place in some translations, Hebrew Bama. And it's interestingly only in this section here, as you see 9, 19, 25, 10, 5, and 13, in the whole first book of Samuel. And as we looked at briefly last time when we looked at the chiasm, the question of the Bama was one that for later prophets, later in the sense of later in the monarchy, and certainly later in the Deuteronomistic history, were abominations. And certainly the so-called reform of Josiah in 2 Kings 23 is all about destroying high places. And the condemnation of King Solomon for worshiping the gods that supposedly his foreign wives led him astray with, also at high places, is a key. But here, early on in the story, that's not an issue. It doesn't appear to be an issue. There's no problem with Samuel going up to that. And that raises the issues that we began to look at last time about whether this is part of an earlier pro-Saul perspective that then has been edited and twisted its perspective through the Judahite Jerusalem-centered perspective that only has Jerusalem and a king there as the place to worship. Some of that's from Mark Luchter, whose piece I brought up last time. I just want to draw attention to it again. Mark Luchter, a great scholar on this material, and he's exploring here how the portrayal of Saul will work through various conventions of how power and authority were used in those days. And also, while I'm here, to bring up the work of Jonathan Jacobs, who's article here is the one I got the chiasm from, and much of what we'll talk about in terms of what's important in the story. So thank you to Mark Luchter and Jonathan Jacobs for providing some really good scholarship to help us understand this passage. Back to our key words here. So another one that we looked at last time, the Hebrew metz for find, and I have last time up. I'll just show you briefly here this list of the finding passages, and you can download that from the last video of the website if you like. But you see here 9 of 39 times in 1 Samuel to find. And so all these words together, the words for to call or come toward, for a high place or shrine, to find or town or city, frame the context of what we're looking at in this story. While we're also here, there's also word plays, and these aren't all immediately in this section, but I draw attention to the word plays and the names because they'll come up a little later in this first section in 1 Samuel 8 to 12, where Saul and Samuel are setting up the terms of relationship between them and Saul and the people in terms of what a prince, a ruler, a nagid, or a king is meant to do. So we see here something that's easily lost in translation, that the Hebrew nagid for prince or ruler, which is what Samuel understands Yahweh told him to anoint Saul as, and the verb to tell, which as you can see is used a number of times in this passage here, are more or less the same word. They're vowel pointed differently, but the consonants are the same. So there's a play there on that. And then the name Shal, which means to ask, and of course I don't need to list out all the places that the names are Saul or Samuel are used here, but we'll see that's a play also, and more wordplay on that in chapter 12, as you can see there in 12, 13, and 19, where that's the question of asking or listening is what comes up. And we'll see that it might work in opposite ways, as we'll see, but we'll get there eventually. So back to our passage here. So they went up to the town, and as they were entering the town, they saw Samuel coming toward them on his way up the shrine. Now that's continuing the perspective that we saw from Saul and the young servant boy's perspective, which, as Jacobs helped us see, I pointed out last time, makes it all seem like it's all coincidence. That Saul's perspective is these things just seem to be happening, and he hasn't put together yet that it's arranged by Yahweh, or at least Samuel wants it to look like it's arranged by Yahweh. You can decide for yourself which is true. So this is just as the servant girls said. They saw Samuel coming out, probably not toward them, because he wasn't aiming for them at this point, but on his way to the shrine to conduct the meal. At least that's what the servant girls thought, to offer the blessing for the sacrifice and the meal that would follow. But then the narrator does a wonderful thing, something not that infrequent in the Bible, but very, to our ears, perhaps a modern thing. He gives us a little flashback. The day before, we shift perspective. We get both the shift of point of view to Samuel's point of view, and we get the inside perspective on what Yahweh said to Samuel, apart from what Saul would know or anybody else would know. So a little shift in time perspective. And what Yahweh had revealed here, literally in the Hebrew, is he came, I think I have it in the note here, in the face of Saul, Yahweh revealed it in Samuel's ears. So Samuel's ears, for a person whose name it is, of hearing Yahweh, or hearing El in this case, hearing God, makes perfect sense. It would say it into Samuel's ears, although that's a common figure of speech in Hebrew, to speak something into somebody's ears. And the word for reveal here, gala, which we saw early on in the initial exploration of Yahweh's relationship with Samuel, when he was still an intern, if you will, to the priest Eli, is the Hebrew version of apocalypsis, the revelation word, or apocalypto, the verb, to reveal something. So a special revelation to Samuel, and here it is. This is what he heard tomorrow about this time, which of course is the today in the story world. I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be ruler over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen the suffering of my people, because their outcry has come to me. Now, if we just had that verse, apart from what we already looked at in chapter 8, with the people wanting a king, and the going back and forth between Samuel and Yahweh, and Samuel and Yahweh and the people over the benefits and burdens of having a king, this verse might surprise us. If we just read it out of context, it won't surprise us. Perhaps we'll just take it as it is. But there are a number of things to draw attention to, given the larger narrative context that we should look at now. So first of all, note that Yahweh doesn't tell Samuel the name of the person, but simply the place he's from, and described as not the tribe of Benjamin, which we'll see Saul describe himself as, from the tribe of Benjamin, the Shevet in Hebrew, but from the land of Benjamin. And a couple of variations on how one look at that. In my note down below, you see it from Barbara Green. She puts it this way: to be a Benjaminite is to be insignificant and worse, shamed and almost eliminated due to their behavior in Judges 19 to 21. Has God made a good selection here? We must ask. And I've explored that perspective earlier in these videos. But also, Luchter invites us to consider from the other perspective that the land of Benjamin was not a negative thing in the original version of this text, but that the Judges text gives it a context that wasn't there in the original. In other words, the anti-Saul factions amongst the people of Israel, or Judah, however you want to call these people more broadly, composed the Judges story to put a blot on the name of Benjamin, a huge blot on the name of Benjamin. So one always has to be asking the question of which text came first, and I'm not going to try to answer that since major scholars read it both directions. But here the emphasis is on the land of Benjamin, not on the tribe of Benjamin, and we'll see what difference that might make later. So that's all he tells him. For whatever reason, Yahweh doesn't say a guy named Saul or the son of Kish or anything else. We'll see differently when it comes to the son of Jesse, David, starting in chapter 16. The land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him. And this is the first time we're hearing the verb mashach, from which Messiah. And you can see in my note below the number of times that's used. In this chapter, in 10 and 15, it's about Saul, and then starting in 16, it's about David. Anointing him to be Nagid, as we see here. So the people wanted a king. They didn't want a Nagid. They wanted a king to be like the other nations. But we don't hear anything about kingship here, and we don't hear anything about the other nations. Note also that Yahweh is insisting over my people Israel. So they're not going to be the people of the king. They're still the people of their God. But Yahweh is acknowledging here to Samuel the allowing of a king to serve as Yahweh's regent in this relationship between God and Israel. And the purpose here, perhaps surprising given what we saw before and what we'll see after, that he shall save my people from the hands of the Philistines. And as my note just for me notes, taking up the role previously assigned to Yahweh, that Yahweh is the one who saves. So why would Yahweh need to have someone else be in the middle to save them? Notice there's nothing here that suggests that Yahweh is upset or there's a problem here. It sounds like something that Yahweh is initiating on Yahweh's own, rather than it being the elders of Israel that insisted on it, and a question of it being a rejection of Yahweh as king, as we saw in chapter 8. But we hear none of that here. And that's the kind of thing that leads some scholars to argue for different sources from different time periods. Then to save not just from all enemies or somebody else, and we've explored that a couple of videos ago, so you might want to go back and look at the question of monarchy and the different perspectives that we saw at the introduction to this section. From the hands of the Philistines in particular. And it won't be the Philistines that Saul gets the most glory for himself and for Yahweh and a sense for readers of his obedience for fighting the Philistines at all, as we'll see, but Ammonites in chapter 11. So that won't happen exactly, but that's what Yahweh says the purpose is. And what precedes that is not that the people demanded a king and rejected Yahweh as king, but that Yahweh saw their suffering and because of their outcry has come to them, which echoes very much the Exodus scene. Let's look at it briefly because it's so classic here. From the end of chapter 2, after a long time the king of Egypt died, the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. And then we shift to Moses and the burning bush. And, of course, that leads to God calling Moses to be the one who will be Yahweh's agent to save the Israelites from the Egyptians. But, of course, Moses won't lead an army, and Moses won't be king. He'll be, as the Deuteronomistic historian describes it in chapter 18, a prophet, and hence the question of a prophet like me, says Moses, to come later. But Saul, in this situation, is presented to us before it happens, although he's going to be anointed as a Nagid, as someone that Yahweh has appointed here to remedy the suffering under the hands of the Philistines. That's one of many expressions, as we'll see as we stay with us. So as readers, we really have to be able to hold many balls in the air at one time, or we'll be subject to either the propaganda of the authors behind it or the characters within the story as we go. So Samuel has all this in mind, and Saul doesn't know it, but we readers know it, and so the encounter begins in verse 17. So when Samuel saw Saul, Yahweh told him, "Here is the one of whom I spoke to you. It is he who shall rule over my people." And my note down below makes that connection to John's Gospel of John the Baptist being told that Jesus, the Lamb, is the one. And so a similar echo forward into that story of a prophet recognizing the one whom God has appointed. But John the Baptist will not fight his way over against Jesus, and he certainly won't tell Jesus what to do the way we're going to see Samuel trying to tell Saul what to do. And so here he is. And in the Hebrew, we have one of the many hinnas here, the behold words. Behold the man. And that's what it is very explicitly here. Hine ha'ish, behold the man. Much like Pilate says about Jesus when he's taken up to be executed on the cross. But that's for another story. So here's the man of whom I spoke to you. It is he who shall rule over my people. And here, it's a different sense. In verse 16 that we just saw, it's to save my people. He'll be a ruler, but the purpose is to save. And here, the word for rule is a very different word than the noun nagid in verse 16, but the verb yetzor, which means to hinder or constrain. And as Polzin and others note, this is not a quote from Polzin, but he also notes, not employed elsewhere to refer to reigning or ruling. As scholar Rudman notes, particularly apt given the context of a people characterized as donkeys. In other words, the people are being presented as if they need someone to have a bridle on them, to have a leash on them, and that's what Saul would do. So that would be taking up the judge's sense at the end of the book of Judges. The people did what was right in their own eyes and needed someone with giving them Yahweh's guidance so they wouldn't wander off in chaos. And we'll see whether that happens or not as the Saul story of his relationship with the people continues. But at the moment, it expresses a very different sense of why Yahweh is appointing this person. Is he being appointed to be like a good parent or like a cop on the beat who will keep things under control and keep people's worst behavior from running wild? Or is it to save somebody from the people from external enemies by leading an army in war? Or both, or some combination of those and others, as we'll see. So this is what Yahweh has told Samuel as the scene unfolds of the encounter here, starting in verse 18. So we get to verse 18, and as my note down below says, the boy's plan regarding the gift is completely forgotten, or at least not narrated. Samuel is now in charge. And that's a good point, perhaps, to look at these 5 scenes. So we have this one here, where Samuel reveals himself to the seer and gives Saul a number of directions, we'll see, in a verb form that really suggests right from the beginning he's trying to take charge. And then, after the banquet, he will anoint him as ruler and send him off with a description of the events that will be happening. But then in chapters 13 and 15, it will go bad. And a couple of times, as we'll see, both in 13 and 15, Samuel will confront Saul for alleged violations of somebody's commands, whether they're Yahweh's commands or Samuel's commands or both. We'll have to see when we get there. And harshly condemns Saul and expresses Yahweh's judgment against Saul. Even when Saul begs for forgiveness and Samuel refuses. And finally, in a very dark scene way later in the book, Saul, desperate in a struggle against David, will go to the woman of Endor to call Samuel up from the dead, and Samuel will come up simply with a grunt message of, "Why are you bothering me? You already know that God has rejected you. I'm going back where I came from." And Saul walks away finally. So it's a terrible trajectory, and from the beginning, Samuel seeks to be in charge, as we see immediately here. So let's scroll down a couple of verses so we can see the rest of our scene here. So then Saul approached Samuel inside the gate. So inside the gate of the city, the area where judgment would take place, where the elders are traditionally gathered in a city. We don't think of a gate having an inside, but it would be like basically a 2-layered wall. So there'd be like an anteroom when you enter the first gate, and you'd encounter someone who's a representative of the city, sort of like a guard, who would regulate incoming and outgoing, and also where the people who sought the elders for justice could meet. And so Samuel's positioning himself in the place where the judges would be. So Saul approached Samuel at that space and said, "Tell me, please," and this is one of the word plays on Nagid, "where is the house of the seer?" And notice that Saul is being polite here. And the Hebrew it has the na for please. So he's deferential to Samuel in a way that Samuel is absolutely not to him. Notice he's asking about the house of the seer. He didn't ask for the seer himself. He asked for the house of the seer. And if you'd been paying attention to the girls, he'd already know that Samuel is the seer. They told him, and we can go back up a few verses in here, just before they got there, they told him, you go up, you will meet him immediately. And so when Saul meets the man he meets, you'd think he would know it was the seer, but apparently he doesn't, or perhaps he's being polite and deferential. Either way, it allows Samuel to be in charge. So he asks for the house of the seer, not the actual seer. And as my note from Bodner has here, this is a double entendre, as we'll see played out especially around House of David, meaning both the physical house and the dynasty. And of course, there is no dynastic house of Samuel because his sons, like Eli's sons, are corrupt. So Saul certainly isn't intending this as a diss on Samuel's children, but as readers we can hear it that way. And perhaps Samuel hears it that way too, and doesn't answer the question. Instead, he says, I am the seer. And then he starts giving orders. Notice how imperative in the English, and it's also in the perfect form in the Hebrew here. Go up before me to the shrine, for today you shall eat with me, and in the morning I will let you go and will tell you all that's on your mind. So all commands from Samuel. Are these Yahweh's commands? There's no invocation of Yahweh. It seems like it's all Samuel. So he identifies himself as the seer, the roe, as we saw in Hebrew, not as the man of God, not as the prophet, not as a judge, not as a priest. And he will exhibit this sense of seer in the sense that he will tell Saul what's on his heart, suggesting a sort of clairvoyance there. So he tells him to go up before me to the shrine, literally to my face, and today you shall eat with me. He doesn't tell him now what we will find out in the next scene, which is he'll eat with 30 chosen invited guests as part of a special celebration. And in the morning I will let you go, as if Saul is constrained already by Samuel, as if he has no freedom to just leave, and will tell you what is on your heart. And again, another one of these word plays, a nagid. As Polza notes, Samuel claims nothing less than a participation in the omniscience of God, at least in a par with that of the narrator. But Samuel's not done giving his little speech here. As for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, and let's look a little more closely. We looked at this early on in the video when we looked at the lost donkeys. As Prieta helps us see, lost by you. The RSV doesn't have this, but the literal reading of the Hebrew, as for your donkeys that you lost 3 days ago. So Saul is not only searching for them because they belong to his father, because it's his responsibility, and he has not found them. And we discover for the first time that this journey starting in the beginning of chapter 9 has taken 3 days. So they've been wandering around and had no bread. They're out of food. So they would be hungry, but they still think the goal is to find the donkeys, and Samuel relieves them of that concern. So give no further thought to them, for they have been found. We don't know who they've been found by or where they were found, but they're now out of the picture. And Samuel brings Saul and readers' attention to what's really at issue in a surprising way. And on whom is all Israel's desire fixed, if not on you and all your ancestral house? But how would that be, since it's only Samuel at this point that knows that Yahweh chose Saul? In fact, we didn't even hear that he chose Saul. We just heard that he chose a Benjaminite, and Samuel presumes that the first Benjaminite that came up to him is him. But how does he know he's a Benjaminite? Because Saul doesn't tell him until the next verse. Samuel apparently exercising some of that divine omniscience here to know that the first man that came up to him was the one that Yahweh picked, even though Saul has not said a word yet, except tell me, please, where's the house of the seer? This issue on whom all Israel's desire is fixed, the word chemda is only here in all of Genesis to 2 Kings, and it illustrates a strong desire. There's no separate word for fixed. But it describes a strong yearning. But we have no sense that Israel is yearning Saul. Perhaps it's simply that Israel is yearning a king, and Samuel knows that since this Saul is the one whom Yahweh has picked to fill that role, therefore Israel's desire is on the one who will be the king. But he also highlights on your ancestral house or your father's house, contrasting with the house of the seer, and we'll see how that says something about the power of Kish, and something that Luchter brought to our attention about how that phrase that's described in the Gibor Hayel back in verse 1, contrary to the New Revised Standard, which says a man of wealth, really means like a local chieftain. So the family of Kish would already be known regionally as a powerful one, and so Kish's son Saul would be a not unexpected person to take up the mantle of military leadership or some other kind of strong leadership. And we'll stop today in what is a little bit of a long video here with Saul's brief response after all that speech from Samuel. So Saul answered, I am only a Benjaminite, as if that's a small thing. And then he says, from the least of the tribes of Israel, and my family the humblest of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin. And we're suddenly introduced for the first time here to some key words about the social structure of ancient Israel. So here's Shebet for tribe and Mishpahah for family here. Words used very commonly, but not that commonly here and for the first time. Because the issue is going to be Bet Ab, or the father's house, and the monarchy. And so these middle layers may drop out when the king represents the people. We'll see that more with David. But you can see it here, how tribes is used here in 1 Samuel, and then a number of times in 2 Samuel. But Mishpahah is not. Mishpahah for family here is used these times here, and only 2 times in 2 Samuel, and one is somebody from the family of Saul, and one about the family struggles within the house of David, as we'll see. So Saul's invoking this more ancient sense of lineage of Mishpahah and Shevet as the way that social structure is organized, and claims how small and humble he is. But it's a false brag here, a humble brag, as people say these days, because everybody knows, including Samuel, that he's from a strong family and he wouldn't be chosen otherwise. And he ends it with a question, which perhaps echoes throughout their entire relationship. Why then have you spoken to me in this way? And that perhaps is Saul's question throughout their relationship, including when Samuel condemns Saul for rejecting Yahweh and disobeying the commands. Why, Samuel, have you spoken to me, Saul, in this way? And we'll take it up at the banquet next time. See you then. Bye-bye.